This is Niceole Levy, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
I want to welcome new primary sponsor, the Blue Cat Screenplay Competition. Blue Cat is now open to submissions for the 2023 competition. The Blue Cat Screenplay Competition has been discovering and developing new storytellers for over 25 years to help new writers get a foothold in the industry. When you submit to Blue Cat, you're guaranteed a thorough read of your script with a written analysis of your submission at no extra fee. Blue Cat believes in supporting writers with more than just an opportunity at the cash prizes, but with feedback to guide each entrant to grow and develop. Blue Cat winners and finalists often make valuable connections in the industry, which help them begin professional careers. In addition, the 5 cash prizes total $18,500 this year. Send in your feature screenplay, TV pilot, or short film script when you're ready. The competition's deadline is October 30th, but if you miss it, you can still catch the late deadline on December 11th. This is Gray, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, episode 131 for October 4th, 2022. Well, what is special about October 4th? It happens to be the launch day of the Writer's Room Survival Guide, which I have right here. And you'd think, who would I be interviewing on a day that this book is launched? Why not the author, Niceole Levy? How are you doing, Niceole?
Hi, I'm great. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And I know I've seen you on a bunch of podcasts. I thank you for coming on this one. Honestly, I was just saying to my wife today that I feel like very soon this is going to be in film schools as required reading. And the reason I say that is because it's almost like a reference book of the different stages that you go through as a TV writer. It's not just somebody breaking in, but it's when you get to the mid-level, what you should be looking out for. When you're at a higher level, what you should be looking out for. And I know I actually have a blurb in the introduction, or not before the introduction of the book. And one of the things I mentioned is that there isn't any other book that comes close to such a comprehensive look at just the life of a writer as it relates to the writer's room. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I love that you mentioned that it feels like a reference book to you. That was very intentional because I wanted it to be the kind of thing where it's a good read, but also like if you're like, what did she say about production? You could just grab it and go straight to that part.
Yeah, very cool. And we're going to go all into the book in the second half of the interview. But first we want to talk about your backstory. Actually, I should mention that our primary sponsor, our new sponsor for this episode, is the Blue Cat Screenplay Competition. And while on the topic, what are some of the reasons a budding TV writer would want to enter a screenplay competition?
Screenplay competitions, and there are so many of them now compared to, I think, when I was like filling out all those applications and submissions 10 years ago. But especially the very big ones, right? Like Blue Cat, like the Final Draft, like Austin Film Festival. It's a good way to get your name out there, and sometimes lower level representatives are checking to see who's placing. They might be looking for new clients. And it also is a great way to meet other writers. You're, hopefully in a world where we're meeting in person, you get to go to a room together and you can start to build your cohort of writers that you're going to go through your career with.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very, very cool. And I think there's also a validation that comes from it. One of the cool things about Blue Cat is they give feedback on every single script. So for the small entry fee, you actually have somebody, a professional, who's giving feedback on your script. That alone is worth the price of the entry.
It is, absolutely. And I know I got feedback when I submitted to the Austin Film Festival as well. And it is really helpful because you're hearing from at the lower levels, the readers who read multiple scripts, so they're coming from it at an angle of comparison. And then if you start to get up into the higher levels, you're getting it from professional working writers, which is pretty great.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so let's talk about your origin story. You grew up in the Mojave Desert.
I did.
How did that lead you to writing?
It led me to writing because I don't know if you've ever been to the Mojave Desert,
Mm-hmm.
but it's about 115 degrees during the summer,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no playing outside. It's 115 degrees. So I played inside with the television on
Mm-hmm.
and was addicted to every soap opera on television because
Mm-hmm.
that's what was on all day. And, acted out TV shows with my Barbies and was just obsessed with television and movies
Yeah.
because too hot to go outside. And I thought all of that meant that I was going to pursue a career in acting, which of
Mm.
course made my parents want to cry. They're like, please don't do that. And it was for multiple reasons. It's the old school, that's not a real job. You're not going to be able to support yourself, all that.
Mm.
They were also concerned about being, a light skinned Black woman coming to Hollywood trying to pursue that goal. At the time, it
Mm.
was, much less frequent to see people who looked like me on television.
Yeah.
And so they were not thrilled. But I was determined, and so I ended up going to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and studying acting.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to read. I'm sure that I'm exaggerating this now,
Mm-hmm.
but it felt like 100 plays. It may not
Yeah.
have been actually 100, but it felt like it.
Yeah.
And in reading all those plays, like I read August Wilson for the first time, and I, read classic plays I had never heard of before. And what I realized was that I was really in love with storytelling
Mm.
and not necessarily performing.
Yeah.
And that was when I made the pivot into writing full time.
Very cool. And you went to USC. Talk about that experience.
I
Fight on.
did. Fight on. I transferred to USC. My parents were really excited
Mm-hmm.
because real school. But my dad was retired from the military. My mom worked at a civil service job. Like, there was no, we're going to put you through USC.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to get a job that at least would keep a roof over my head and take out many, many student loans.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became a police dispatcher.
Wow.
And I used to work graveyard shift and then go to school all day.
Wow.
And I went into USC as an undeclared major because, of course, if you didn't get into film school, you could still get into the school
Mm-hmm.
and then keep trying to get into film school. I could not afford to keep trying to get into film school because
Right.
student loans. So
Yeah.
I found out that the English department had a creative writing major.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became an English major and wrote tons of short stories and, got a really good, solid writing education.
Mm-hmm.
And then was a little terrified of what happened next. And I heard about the Master of Professional Writing program, which used to be at USC, is no
Mm-hmm.
longer, sadly. And T.C. Boyle was one of my he was my senior writing professor.
Wow.
And I went to his office and we had started off on a rough note. Like, he savaged the first thing I turned into him.
Uh-huh.
But we got, we found a way to work, and I learned, and he started to like my writing. And I walked in his office and was like, I'm thinking about applying to MPW. I don't know. And he wrote me a letter of recommendation and said, walk this over and turn in your
Wow.
application. And so I did, and it was a great decision. It really gave me time to work on my craft in a way that I hadn't yet. And
Mm.
so terrific program, really grateful to it. And
Very cool.
then I spent 10 years beating my head against the Hollywood wall.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is really good for people here. I mean, I know we say often on this podcast that the general, I don't know, the feeling out there is you get a good degree and somebody should just hand you a job. And even a school like USC, I mean, you hear stories of, Josh Schwartz, who actually sold something when he was in his junior year at USC. That's not necessarily typical,
Right.
and it takes a lot of hard work.
Takes a lot of hard work, and especially when you go a little bit in a different path. I have friends who went to the film school and they were able to land good internships or good entry level sort of positions, but I didn't have the film school connection since I didn't
Mm.
go there. And so I really kind of had to hustle on my own, and
Yeah.
it took the time it took.
Yeah. Well, so what did you do in that time? Tell me about your writing process, and Did you join any writing groups? I know that you did get into actually more than one writing fellowship, the CBS Writers Mentoring Program and NBC's Writers on the Verge. Talk
Right.
about how you applied to those and what you got out of them.
Sure. So one thing, and I don't even know if I mentioned this in the book, but I actually, the first program that I got deep into the process with was the Disney Writing Fellowship.
Oh, okay.
And I made it to the last group before they made the final cuts. And I was Christmas shopping when I got the phone call that I didn't make the final group. But I look back on that now with gratitude because
Mhm.
I wasn't ready yet. I really was not ready to have the toughness that's required when, someone walks in and gives you notes and there's a lot of red, your script is dripping red and all of that. I wasn't ready yet. I hadn't sort
Mm.
of built up my muscles enough. So I'm grateful for having gone through the experience, but I also know that I wasn't ready.
Mm.
And so in the meantime, I was lucky enough I made a living off my degrees. I worked in magazine publishing, and then I became a closed captioner because I could do that on graveyard shift and
Mhm.
take meetings and stuff during the day.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, it was great. And it was also like getting another master's degree in television
Mhm.
because I was literally typing every line of dialogue
Wow.
from, Grey's Anatomy and Private Practice and Brothers and Sisters and all the ABC shows that had large ensemble casts. I
Mhm.
was like, and and I also would have the script so I could see what got cut out. I could
Mm.
see, what lines changed, different things. So you kind of started to see, oh, okay, this is the decisions they make after the script is written, and
Very
start to
cool.
get that kind of look into it. And then, I came up at the time when the way in was writing specs
Mhm.
of existing shows. So I wrote before I finally got my first job 12 specs.
12 specs. Wow.
12 specs. And so I was I wrote a lot. When
Mhm.
I was frustrated and couldn't write scripts, I wrote fanfic. I wrote
Uh-huh.
thousands of pages of
Oh,
fanfic.
it sounds exactly like my daughter. My daughter's say and actually interestingly, she did the same thing. She got into USC, but not the film program. Though in her second year, she was able to transfer in.
Right.
But she loves fanfic, and she's written like novellas worth
Yes, neat.
of it.
And but it's great writing practice, right? Especially
Yeah.
because you sometimes have to write characters you don't like, which is
Hmm.
very good practice for TV writing because if the characters on your show, you have to write them. And so you have to learn to do that.
Yeah.
And I was really lucky. I met through a part-time job I had while I was finishing my master's thesis. I had stopped dispatching and was sort of trying to like give myself a break while I wrote my master's project.
Hmm.
And this wonderful writer named Joyce Burdett, who was a very successful novelist. She created the TV show Diagnosis Murder.
Hmm.
She also gave the world Jack Burdett, who happens to be one of my favorite comedy writers. So I'm
Uh-huh.
very grateful to her for that. And we became friends, and she became a mentor to me. And she would always sort of check in, see what I was working on. And she tried really genuinely to help me, but nobody wanted unexperienced writers. And it was a rough time to be trying to break
Hmm.
in. And she just stayed on top of me. And when I finally, and this is a little jump in the story, but we can go back and cover, when I did finally make the semifinals at the
Hmm.
CBS Writers Mentoring Program, and I always tell the story because she deserves that I tell it. She wrote Carol Kirshner and said, "You would be crazy if you didn't take Nicole."
Oh, wow.
And it's just she's such a wonderful human being that she took the time to do that for me.
Hmm. Very cool.
Yeah.
You know, it seems very much like when I interviewed Sean Ryan. He had a very similar process. And it's funny. Everybody looks at Sean Ryan like he's this mega showrunner and stuff, but it took him years to
Yes.
develop his craft. Years where he was writing scripts that weren't getting anywhere, and he had to find ways to improve his craft. Um, I think everybody dreams of landing that staff gig right out of school, but I can see that time is necessary.
It's absolutely necessary. And in fact, I love that you brought Sean up because I went to a panel when I was still kind of trying to break in,
Hmm.
and Sean read a list of every spec he had written.
Yeah.
And I wrote a blog about why it was important to write specs. And at the end, I talked about how many I had written in comparison, and like, you write them until you don't need them anymore.
Yeah.
And I will say, I am the proselytizer of people should still be writing specs
Hmm.
if you're trying to break into the business. Not all the time, not you should write as many specs as you write pilots. Pilots
Hmm.
are the thing most people will want to read,
Hmm.
but specs are training you to do the job you actually want to do,
Yeah.
which is write in a showrunner's voice, in a specific tone, in exactly the way that the showrunner writes it, because
Yeah.
that's the job.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree. And honestly, I mean, I think, hey, approach it like fanfic, but it can be very fun to do that.
Absolutely.
I mean, my daughter's writing pages from Umbrella Academy and Severance. It's like
That's it.
it feels like she's on those shows, and she writes stuff that looks like it could have been out of the pages of their scripts. And I think people people do so much of they listen to a podcast or an interview or panel or that kind of thing, and they hear somebody say something, and they think, okay, they said that I only need pilots, so I'm only going to write pilots. Well, how do you know the form if you don't practice with emulating shows? Like, I think it's a much better tool when you're starting out to get familiar with the form, familiar with storytelling. How do you build scenes and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And look, I always spec shows I loved. I never cared what was popular or what someone would be like, "Oh, you should spec this show." I was like, "No, I'm going to spec a show I love." My career got jump started by a spec of The Closer, which
Hmm.
everyone was like, "No one in the business watches that."
Yeah.
And I was like, "I don't care. I love it. I had a great story to tell." And so many people who read it were like, "I don't even watch the show, but I had to find out how the story ended." And that's
Very cool.
real. And
Yeah.
the last spec I wrote was an episode of Person of Interest, which I loved like a crazy
Hmm.
person.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I had so much fun writing it. I mean, what do I care that no one ever read it but my manager? Like, I
Yeah.
loved it.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Yeah, and I know it can be really tough to write a pilot. I mean, even for established writers, and expecting somebody who is just starting out to build a whole world, build all these characters, and do the toughest thing you can possibly do in such a way that it represents you well enough to get representation or a job. I mean, that's a tall order.
It's a very tall order, and I think that's also part of why, stopping to do the occasional spec so that you always have one current one, it it always forces you to look at structure again, to look at,
Hmm.
how you get to an act out. And again, firm believer that everyone should be breaking with act outs, even if you're not putting act outs in your script in terms of
Hmm.
writing end of act one, you should still be breaking like you are.
Yeah.
And because it's going to give you the best flow of your show.
Hmm.
And there are people who, they want broadcast money, but they've never tried to write a broadcast act out. And
Hmm.
it's the whole job, honestly. Like, being in broadcast, like, breaking story, finding great character moments, but it's nailing the act out. That is your
Hmm.
job.
Yeah.
Because you got to
Yeah.
get people to
It's
come back.
Yeah, like even in feature films are technically just a 2 hour blob, and yet there's a lot of screenwriters and directors that still thinking about it in the reels. There would be 11-minute reels that would play, um, in previously before we delivered digital files, but you would have a canister of 11 minutes worth of film, and then they would cut that together with all the other ones. And a lot of people to this day still think of every 11 minutes, I've got to build to something and then let it go down and then build to that next 11 minutes, just so that they have that,
Yes.
flow, like that up and down, not just a straight line of action.
Yeah, it's really important because you want to, like, raise the stakes, and then you want to give your audience a chance to, like, feel it and catch their breath and be upset about what happened and be mad at you because you didn't, like, why did you do it that way? And then, take them on another ride. Like, you need that, or people tune out, is my feeling, especially with as much television as we have now.
Yeah. So anyway, so you did those fellowship programs, and tell me about landing your first staff gig. How did that happen?
So I did the CBS Writers Mentoring Program, and then in case I didn't get staffed or anything, I had applied to Writers on the Verge at NBC. I was lucky enough to get in and go work over there with Karen Horn's amazing group and Jen Grisanti. And basically, I came out of the program like on fire. I got an agent, I got a manager, I had so many general meetings. I was up for 4 jobs.
Wow.
And every single time it was like, it's between you and one other person. And the job went to one other person every single time.
Oh, wow.
And it was just the way it broke. And there was the week where it was going into Memorial Day. And so it was like, didn't get a job, Friday, didn't get a job, like heartbroken. And so I let myself cry for 24 hours. And then I was like, okay, what else can you do? And I applied to the Disney Fellowship, which was still taking applications. And I submitted to the Austin Film Festival. I ended up once again making it to the finals of the Disney program, but not getting the final cut. And I placed that year, I can't remember which year was semifinals and which was finals, but I advanced in Austin and went for the first time, and it was like a great experience. So,
wow.
Found some victory from the jaws of defeat.
Yeah.
And wrote a new pilot. And that was what I could control. I could write a new pilot. And so the next year, I was not getting any meetings. And in the aftermath of me getting my first job, several of my upper level writer friends were like, I didn't want to tell you that, like, nobody was meeting with lower levels, and I was so worried you were going to freak out. But like,
oh, no.
I was like, we kept our fingers crossed for you.
Wow.
And but as it turned out, what happened was Ken Sanzel, who was running Ironside, had asked to read, staff writers that the Writers on the Verge program had. And the studio, I knew all the people at the studio who had covered the show because I had been through the program or had meetings with them the year before. My mentor from the program was the development executive. And then everyone was like, yeah, if you like Niceole, you can have her. And so I ended up doing a Skype interview because Ken was still in New York.
Yeah.
And it, I thought it went really well, but whoever knows. And he was like, okay, well, it'll be a few days and then I'll make my decision. And I was like, okay, great. Thanks for the opportunity. And I went off to have a lunch date with a friend of mine. And typically I try when I'm out with my friends not to have my phone out. And so we were wrapping up and I pulled out my phone and there were like 17 texts or missed calls. And I was like, well, this is either really good or real bad. And it was real good. And it was the offer for my first job.
Very, very cool. So talk about that first room experience. I mean, you had waited a long time for that.
Yes.
What was that like?
I had definitely waited a long time for it and trained really hard for it, I thought. And then, of course, my first room was one of the unusual ones that wasn't a room.
Oh, wow.
It was Ken preferred to work in like one-on-one with writers and not have a room full time. And so we had a writer's hallway. And so what I learned very quickly was that the skills I had learned, right, to succeed in a writer's room were the same skills. I just had to use them differently. So I had to come in the morning and stop by everybody's office and be like, hey, how was your night? Like, do you need any help with anything? And build my relationships that way because we weren't sitting around a table all day. And, it helped that, I got very lucky that someone I knew was on staff. So I had like a cushion. But also what Ken did that I encourage every showrunner I know to do is he made it very clear that he had hired us the two staff writers because he believed in us. And so
Mm.
the mandate was help the staff writers. Like, don't leave them in
Yeah.
their floundering.
Yeah.
And they did. And I'm still in touch with everybody from that staff. It was a great group
Wow.
of people. And, they really wanted us to succeed. And I
Yeah.
learned a ton from them, and I'm really grateful for it.
Very, very cool. Yeah, you know what? The showrunner has so much power in that way. It's funny because there's some who are like that, and then there are some who are stealing credit from the uh, newer writers, and it's like, how do you reconcile that? And
Yeah,
I guess that's a lot of what you talk about in your book.
yeah, look, there are great showrunners, there are horrible showrunners, and then there's plenty in between.
Hmm.
And most people, I feel like, fall in the in between where they're pretty solid. They're gonna make some mistakes. Might have
Hmm.
like, a couple things that you'd be like, watch out for this if you work for them. But they're
Yeah.
not, you're not reporting them to HR about stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's levels of it, right? So one thing I say in the book that's super important is everybody has bad days. So even the showrunner that you adore
Hmm.
might come in the door one day and just be like, what are you all doing in here? I asked you to do this and I get this in return. Like,
Hmm.
what are you doing with your time? And you'll be like, oh, we're in trouble. And
Yeah.
you let them have their moment, and then they go away, and then you redo the work because you will probably be tasked with redoing the work.
Hmm.
And the next day everything's fine. And you don't know what precipitated that, right? They could have had a horrible call with the network. They could be fighting with their wife. Like, you just don't know.
Hmm.
And so they're having a bad day, and you're going to have bad days, and you hope people have grace for you.
Yeah.
The behavior that starts to get really difficult, right, is there are showrunners who thrive on chaos.
Hmm.
So they are always looking for a way to cause chaos.
Yeah.
And I think they're not even aware of it. That's what they feel like. They're not working if it's not hard.
Hmm.
And so this is the kind of showrunner who reads 10 pages of a script and throws it out. And so you're all re-breaking it without knowing what he really didn't like about the episode. You just know he didn't like those 10 pages, right? That's
Yeah.
it. The kind of person who doesn't stick to a calendar, who, you're in prep and you still haven't even finished the outline for the episode. Nightmare.
Hmm.
The kind of person who thinks that people work for them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and don't respect that writers have lives and families and things they need to take care of. We all get paid really well so that when you do have to work through a weekend, you're like, yeah, that's what the money's for. It's not supposed to be all the time.
Yeah.
It's just
Well,
not.
you know what? I unfortunately have had a couple experiences with a pretty toxic work environment, and it's then that I remind myself that at least the mercy is the contracts are fairly short.
Yes. Yes. And that's one of the keys if you're in a bad situation. And if you are in one of those notorious situations, right? We've all read
Hmm.
about them now because they've become very public, where you have someone who is truly abusive in the room.
Hmm.
I would encourage everyone to try to find a way to report if they can do it and feel safe.
Hmm.
But it's a hard decision. I mean, I'm not sure I would have been able to do it when I was a newer writer and, trying to get my bones in. Like, it's scary because you are
Hmm.
afraid you'll never work again. If you are too intimidated to report, though, you have to talk to someone. If it's not someone on your show, if there's no one on your show you can trust about to talk to about the behavior, that's when you use the network of writers that you've built up. That's when you call the Writers Guild and say, I don't want you to do anything. I just need to talk to someone about what my options are here.
Hmm.
And they will do that. They're not allowed to file a complaint or do anything without your okay, but they
Hmm.
will give you advice.
Yeah.
And if you feel like I don't want to I don't want to report, I just want to tough it out and get through it, that's a perfectly acceptable choice. But tell your reps, hey, this is what's going on. I
Hmm.
don't want you to talk to anybody. I just
Right.
want you to know that I need to be done as soon as the season's over. So
Yeah.
we're gonna be prepared to take me out for staffing. And that's a perfectly valid choice. But if you feel really truly in danger, like there have been people who've literally put hands on their employees, that's
Wow.
not okay. And if you are afraid to report, you got to at least talk to someone who can then step into that person and say, you can't put your hands on our employees. That's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thankfully, these are hopefully few and far between. It's not every show that this happens, but when it does, you need to be ready.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I definitely think the business is trying to weed all those folks out. We all know there's still some out there.
Hmm.
Um, and another thing I would say is don't don't be afraid that that tyrannical showrunner is gonna fire you, because everyone in town knows who those showrunners are, and they
Hmm.
all know everyone gets fired off those shows. Like, it happens.
Yeah.
So it's no skin off you. Everyone's gonna just be like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I can think of a few pretty big shows where, I mean, every writer I talked to was like, I got fired, and so did that person, and so did that person, and so did
That's
that person.
Yeah, it's easy to tell. It's like if you
Yeah.
go look at the credits and you're like, oh, all these writers were only there for one season. We all
Hmm.
know what that means.
Yeah. So anyway, back to your story. I know we want to get to the book real quick, but just signposts of. I mean, you've written on Allegiance, Mysteries of Laura, Shades of Blue, Cloak and Dagger, Fate, the Winx Saga, S.W.A.T. You co-wrote the feature, The Banker, which is on Apple TV Plus. What are some sort of signposts through that time? Things you learned, important things that
Yeah,
happened.
absolutely. So the first thing, and I think the most important thing, is when you're in those staff writer, hopefully only year. In my case, I was a staff writer 3 times because
Oh
title
well.
repetition's real. Um, I was terrified in the Allegiance room, right? Because it was the first real room I had been in. And
Mm-hmm.
I on a break sent a text to a very good friend of mine and was like, I feel like the dumbest person in this room. And her response was, everyone in that room feels dumb. They're all trying to prove they belong there.
Wow.
Just take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. So like you it's all going to be fine. Like, you're not the only person in that room who's scared. You're the one with the least to prove, honestly, because you
Mm.
haven't done it before. So no one expects you to have the best idea. If you have a great idea, they're going to be thrilled. But nobody expects the staff writer to save the day, to save the show, to pitch the greatest episode in the history of television, or to write a perfect script. So take
Mm.
those expectations off yourself. As you start to move up the ladder, you're going to find people who recognize in you what you're great at, what your skill set is, right? And I had come from a very demanding job. I had been in law enforcement, I was a dispatcher. I knew how to command a group of people. And people started to recognize that and be like, can you cover the room? Can you wrangle all this research and then, bring in an expert to talk to us about it? They'll start to rely on you for the things that you display a natural talent for.
Mm.
And so that's how you'll start to really stand out. And you get those opportunities by never saying no to things that are easy to do, right? If the showrunner's swamped and says, oh my God, I got to write these character bios and these sides for casting, offer to do them,
Mm.
at least just to take the first pass. And the showrunner's going to go through it anyway. But they get to start from pages instead of from a blank screen,
Mm.
which is,
Well, and when you co-wrote that feature, that was with the showrunner of Allegiance, wasn't it?
yes.
So how did that happen?
So that happened because, especially when you go through the writing programs, and also if you read my book, you will see there's a lot of things that you'll hear about how to make yourself indispensable. And
Mm-hmm.
I took all those things to heart. So I was one of the first people in. I could never beat John Glennon, but I was there right after him if I could be. Um, I was one of the last ones out every day. If our room shut down because we were having an emergency in New York, I stayed in the office and was always there. And so they came to rely on me as a person who they could come in and be like, Niceole, can you just like bang out a description of what the scene is supposed to be? Because we can't find the notes and whatever. And I would remember and be like, sure. And just doing whatever you can to help the showrunners and the EPs
Mm.
when their hair's on fire is invaluable. And I built a really solid relationship with all of them, George included. And when George was looking for someone to co-write The Banker with him, you know, he was reminded by Rashad and John how much they all relied on me. And he asked if I had a feature sample, which I did, and I sent it
Mm.
to him with no idea why he was asking. I mean, I was just like, maybe he just wants to read it. I don't know.
Yeah.
And the next week he called and pitched the story to me of The Banker and asked if I wanted to co-write with him. And it was, an absolute joy. And I'm so
Wow.
grateful for the opportunity. And it's directly leading to my second feature because wrote a feature called Spark that's
Mm.
about this amazing woman named Claudette Colvin who as a 15-year-old girl refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama 9 months before Rosa Parks did.
Wow.
And so this is kind of the story of why we don't know her name better.
Mm.
And Anthony Mackie, who is in The Banker, is going to direct it.
Oh,
And
wow.
so that's how I got pulled into the whole thing was, having worked with Anthony before. So
Yeah.
it continues to pay dividends. The hard work continues to pay off.
That is very, very cool. So, at what point did you do the showrunner training program?
So I did showrunner training after I had come off of Fate. Oh, no, before Fate. Um, Sorry, I just lost my timeline. No, it was
Hmm.
when I got back because then we shut down. Our last class got canceled because of the pandemic. So that's
Oh,
what
okay.
happened. And I had ended up developing a show with Carol Mendelssohn's company. And so I had a pilot that I sold, and that at the time was had been bought by Charter for their Spectrum originals.
Hmm.
And so I got to do showrunner training. So at that point, I was a co-EP. And it's such a great program. The interesting thing was I had actually sat through the entire course before
Oh, yeah.
because right before I did Allegiance, Carol Kirshner, who also co-runs that program, picks someone she knows to do the note taking for the
Hmm.
classes, and so I had taken notes through the entire course once
Wow.
before. And so it was so interesting to be back now as a participant and oh, I remember when I heard this the first time and I was like, who
Yeah.
would do something like that? And then I was in rooms where I saw people do something like that.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating to be back in it again.
Yeah.
But it's a great, it's a lot of work for them to put it together, and
Mm.
so it's so hard to get in. But I'm incredibly grateful that I had the chance to do it because it really it not only helps prepare you for the job. There's a lot of things that you just don't think about in terms of the business part of what you're going to have to do, and so it
Hmm.
helps prepare you for that. But it also, again, it gives you this new cohort of writers who are all at the same level as you. We're all going through the same struggles, and we email each other constantly about, like,
Mm.
have you ever had someone say this to you? Like, what does this note mean? And why won't they
Yeah.
let me have writers on set? And we just, are in constant communication with each other. So it's
Mm.
invaluable.
Yeah. And I think it bears mentioning that any of those fellowships and programs, and even film school in general, I think one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is that networking part of it. Um, I mean, 15, 20 years after film school, I was still getting most of my jobs from guys in class who were
Yes.
like, "Hey, this show came up, that show came up. You interested in this? You free?" And I mean, it can't be understated how critical it is. Not just like it won't just happen by osmosis. Like you have to say, "Hey, let's exchange emails. Hey, let's get together for a coffee or lunch,"
Yeah.
and make that happen.
Yeah, it's a part of the deal. Like if you want to work in this industry, and so you find people that it's genuine with. Like I don't ever encourage people to like try to fake those bonds in order to just have someone that they have a connection to, even though they don't really like them. There's going to be plenty of people you like. Just stay in touch with those people
Hmm.
and be supportive of them. When people that I've worked with who have been writers assistants or, script coordinators on the shows that I've been on reach out to me and they're like, "Hey, I have a staffing opportunity. Can you write an email for me?" I'm so thrilled to do it because,
Hmm.
everybody works hard. And one of the things, I think it was Carol actually in the CBS Writers Program pointed out was that when you're working on a show, even if you're only a staff writer, I will say in quotes because it's a big deal to be a staff
Hmm.
writer, but when you're the staff writer and everybody else has written 10 years of television and 20 years of TV, you feel like, oh. But the writer's assistant and the script coordinator and the writer's PA all want to be you.
Mm.
They all want to be you. They want that first job for themselves. So remembering that and being kind to them and mentoring them is a great way to start that networking experience.
Very cool. Well, that is a great segue into your book. Before we talk about that, we're going to have a brief ad break. And when we come back, we're going to talk all about the Writer's Room Survival Guide. DrivingFootage.com provides 360-degree driving plates for film and TV. Over 14,000 clips are available for locations all around Southern California, with over 100 new cities from the U.S. and Canada coming in 2023. A fully equipped camera car with height-adjustable rig is available for custom shoots. Visit DrivingFootage.com for details. AVGearGuy.com uses state-of-the-art technology to bring new life to old films and videos, like the Lost Betty White series, Pet Set, which they recently restored for its 50th anniversary. They can apply the same technology to your documentary, film and video archive, and family videos. Visit avgearguy.com for details. Full disclosure, I do own both of these companies. By supporting them, you help me bring new in-person videos to you. And we're back. And first off, something I like to ask all authors. There are a lot of books out there on TV writing, a lot more than I had in film school, and a lot more than there were 10 years ago. Why this book and why now? What was missing in the writing out there?
It's interesting because it wasn't a thing I had really thought about. And once again, Carol Kirshner
Mm.
brought to my attention that Michael Weesey was looking for someone to write a book in this area. And I was like, that's a good idea. Someone should do
Mm.
that. And as I say in the book, she was like, you should do that. And I was like, no, I don't have time to write a book. That's crazy. But as Carol is wont to do, she would not let up on it.
Yeah.
And so I spoke with the publishers and I was like, okay, let me try to write a table of contents. And when I sat down, I realized how many things I wished I had known
Mm.
before I learned those lessons, right? How much I
Right.
wish someone had said to me, I know it's going to sound ridiculous, but sit close to the door if you have to go to the bathroom all the time. So that you're not
Yeah.
disturbing anyone when you get up and go. And it's common sense, but you're so nervous that you're not thinking about that when you pick a
Yeah.
seat. And so that's really what got me started. And it was, I think, a side effect of it that I was really happy about is I've taught a few classes since I started being a working writer, and I love it. I love teaching, and
Mm.
I just didn't have time to do it anymore. So this book felt like a way I could sort of teach without being in a classroom.
Mm. Well, yeah, I think from my perspective, I've read probably 40 or 50 books in the area now, and most of the books are about how to write a script, how to build characters, like it's all about getting you in the door.
Right.
But everything I know about the writer's room is that really writing a script isn't what you need on day 1 or day 5 or day 50.
Absolutely.
Um, it's about a lot more than that, and there's very little out there on that. As a matter of fact, even the showrunner training program is something that was brought in because there were so few resources for people who were on staff. There was
Right.
lots of resources to get people on the staff, but all of a sudden it's like, okay, let's sink or swim.
Yes. No, I think that's really true. And I'm not sure why that was.
Mm-hmm.
I know, the fellowships helped because so often if you were lucky enough to go through a fellowship, that the alumni come back, so you have very experienced people coming back and talking to you. You know, my relationship with Aaron Rashawn Thomas, who I worked with at SWAT, started because he came back to talk to the CBS program. You
Hmm.
know, plenty. Nichelle Tramble Spellman, same thing, she came back to speak to us and we became friends. So it it you get that if you're in those programs, but if you're not, it really is sort of this mystery box and you have
Hmm.
no way of knowing what happens in there. And even like my very close friends who are not writers were always like, but wait, what does that mean? Like when you say that, I don't understand what it means when you say you were breaking a story. Like what is that?
Hmm.
And I stop and explain it to them and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that's how you did it. But you know, people are so fascinated with television, but they don't really understand all the stuff that goes into it. So I think people who want to know how the sausage is made will also enjoy the book because it's very much like, no, this is really what happens. Like on Twitter, you'll see so often a popular show will air and like
Hmm.
people will harass the writer whose name is on that episode.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, no, no, all of them made the episode. Like, don't
Yeah.
hurt, like if you're mad, you shouldn't just be mad at Nicole. You should be like mad at everybody, but also don't be mad. It's a TV show. Like,
Hmm.
so I
Yeah.
mean, as a fangirl, I have had my share of angry watching of television, so I get it. But like, don't be mean to people on Twitter. It's not okay.
Yeah. Well, and I talk to writer after writer after writer, and usually we talk a lot about that first staff experience. And for most people, it's a shock. It's a rude awakening. It's like totally confused what to do, and like not knowing anybody else in the room and not knowing when to speak and what's expected. And I thought, I mean, one of the things that impressed me about your book was how detailed a picture you were able to paint about every single level, from that writer's assistant or the writer's PA, onto the staff, onto the producer, onto when you get on set, and all those different levels. Talk about, because it's one thing to observe, it's another to be able to articulate it.
You know, I feel like I have always been a student of television, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's just continued in my career, right? I think I talk in the book about every room as a chance for you to find out how to do your job better. And
Mm.
part of that's being an observer, and part of it's being like, oh, I love when we do this. Like, this is a great thought exercise. I'm going to remember this when I run a room.
Mm.
And to also be like, oh, I am never doing that when I run a room. And like, mean it, mean it. If it upset you, don't do it when you run a room.
Mm.
And that's how you start to find out what your style is. So that as you move up the ranks, when someone makes you a number two on a show, yes, you're going to have a conversation with the showrunner about how they like to do things, but you're going to kind of start to impose your style on the room a little bit because the
Mm.
showrunner's usually not there. So as long
Mm.
as the showrunner's getting what they want, they don't necessarily care how we get there. And I have very much, my style has come from two of my number twos or co-EPs that I
Mm-hmm.
kind of amalgamated their styles together. And it's very much how I do things because it worked. I took everything that was great about both of them and merged them together and it works.
Mm.
And when you're on set, it's the same thing. It's set is so overwhelming. There's so many people. You're trying desperately to learn everybody's name. You do
Mm.
have to. You have to learn everybody's name. It's
Yeah.
really hard. I'm not going to lie. Make a cheat sheet. One of the shows I was on did this thing that I thought was brilliant, and I
Mm.
will do it on my show, which is they just had everybody's ID picture with their
Mm.
name and their department so that
Very
like
cool.
as you were like you could get it in LA and like as you were flying to set be like studying, so you'd be like, hi Nicole, when you saw someone when you got off and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
look at you. And but it was a great because all people want is to be acknowledged, right? To know
Mm.
that you know their name, you know what they do, you know how hard they work. And but it's really difficult.
Mm.
I sort of equate it to the same thing when you're in the room on those early days. You're going to feel like, everybody's a race car moving around you, and you're just standing there and trying to figure out like what are we doing? Why is everyone going so fast? I don't understand. It's all happening so fast. And you're going to find moments to say things that might make it to the board, that might get shut down. It won't matter, but you have to speak. You have to find your opportunities. But that's what it feels like. It's happening so quickly, and it's so overwhelming. And then you'll start to get your feet under you. And then if you're lucky enough to be on a show where they send you to set, you're going to get to set, and it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be like, there's so many people, and I don't remember who is that I'm supposed to tell that we changed the line. I don't remember.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons for when you arrive extremely early and stay late. Those sort of quieter conversations you have when there's nobody else around and it's you arrive and there's just one other person there, those go so far.
They do, absolutely. I mean, look, one of my best friends in the world, I became friends with because she would come into work early and I would be there, and while she made her coffee, we would talk. And we had not known each other at all. And within a few months, people were like, wait, you guys didn't know each other before the show? But like we're each other's people. But like we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't had those moments to talk, you know? And it's also your opportunity to ask questions, right? One of the things I recommend is, so at the end of the day, you know, you'll usually talk about what you're going to do the next day. And say your number 2 is like, okay, tomorrow we got to figure out this gap in Act 3. Like we can't keep ignoring it. So when you go home, think about the gap in Act 3, and maybe you have an idea. And if you're there with enough time before the room starts in the morning, you can go to a friend that you've made. You can go to your number 2 and be like, I don't know. I think I came up with an idea that might help Act 3, and pitch it to them ahead of time. And sometimes they'll be like, no, you should definitely pitch that. Let's see what happens. And sometimes they might be like, oh, I totally get why you went there. I actually said something similar to the showrunner and they already said no. Fine. But like, it's a way for you to try out ideas and to find a way to get your voice heard in the room.
Yeah. And a lot of it is just sheer initiation too. I mean, often post is in the same building, just walking down and introducing yourself to the editors, introduce yourself to the production manager or whoever has their office in that same building. And like those are the conversations that can result in work later. I mean, it could be literally an editor. I know of cases where an editor went onto a show and recommended the writer that he had worked with before.
Yeah, absolutely. So true story that Jim Corey was the line producer on Ironside. And, you know, I had never been on a TV set before. And Ken was doing some reshoots in downtown and on a weekend. And I was like, hey, is it okay if I come down? Because I want to see this. And they were like, you want to come down, kid? Come on down. That's great. And so I was friends with Ken's assistant. And so I was sort of like, tell me where to stand. Like, I don't want to be a moron and do whatever. And Jim Corey teased me about the shoes that I wore. And he was right. I did not wear good enough shoes. I never made that mistake on set again. But, you know, and so we go through our whole thing. You know, he's on set for my episode. And that's when we got canceled. So, you know, it was like good and bad. I did not see Jim Corey again for years. And then while I was in Kareem Zarik's office at Marvel TV, trying to get Marvel to hire me to write something, I mentioned, because Jim Corey was the line producer for every, you know, Marvel show. And I said, oh, you know, or I guess he was technically like the head of production. And I was like, you know, I worked with Jim Corey on Ironside. And he was like, oh, I know, he remembers you.
Oh,
and
wow.
I was like, how great is that he remembers me, you know? And it's like, because I took some initiative to ask to learn more. And I was always asking questions, and I was always like, okay, but what does it mean when we say this? Because, you know, some of the lingo is new to me and I didn't know. And I was really concerned about making my days. I was really concerned about, making sure the crew got their breaks. And he remembered that about me.
Hmm. I'm trying to think back. I've interviewed a lot of different people, and I can't remember a situation where asking too many questions was ever a problem.
It's absolutely one of the smartest things you can do. I was just telling someone that, like, sometimes in the room, honestly, like when the room is struggling, sometimes the best thing you can do is say, guys, just for me, can we clarify what exactly we're trying to get to on the other side of this? Because I feel like I've lost track of it a little bit.
Hmm.
And let someone repeat what the goal is. And sometimes that's all it takes for the room to go, what? Well, okay, so why are we talking about this thing? Why don't we go back?
Hmm.
Let's go back 3 steps to this, and we can just do that, and then we're there.
Hmm.
Or if someone wants to do a certain kind of story, and you're like, okay, what does that story look like on our show? It's a perfectly valid question. And then people start talking, and you're like, oh, yeah, I think we could do that.
Hmm.
Questions are good. And if you don't want to ask the showrunner, which I get, showrunners are busy. And unless you have a showrunner who said, my door is always open, come ask me
Hmm.
questions, that's why you have to be building those relationships. So you have someone else to ask. I think really good showrunners have upper level writers who know without being told that part of their job is to look out for the lower level writers,
Yeah.
to be the person who answers questions, to, help with script notes, all of that stuff. So
Hmm.
hopefully you have that person in your room.
Yeah. Well, now, and that brings up a really, really important point. Is we've been in Zoom rooms for quite a while, and it looks like they're here to stay for another little while, at least in a hybrid way. Um,
Right.
how do you have those water cooler conversations? How do you meet the editor? How do you replace that kind of interaction?
It is challenging. I mean, I definitely will not try to act like it's super easy. On S.W.A.T, we were really lucky that Sean is a big believer in every writer goes to set, every writer goes to post.
Hmm.
So because we were first year of COVID, so it was all Zoom, everything except for being on set. But our editors were on our Zoom, so we would still get to meet the editor who was cutting our
Hmm.
episode, and we would, meet the post production supervisor, and, like, you still got to understand who all those people were. Plus, in your prep meetings, right, they're usually part of that, and
Hmm.
so you can start to, it's as simple as, oh, once I know that, Gray is going to cut my episode, I'm just going to shoot an email and be like, hey, here's my email, here's my cell. If you need anything from me that you're not getting, let me know.
Hmm.
So simple
Oh
that
boy! As speaking as an editor, when producers take the time to do that, it's extremely helpful.
I think it's so important because, right, if you're on a show that requires a set report, they're all different, right? No 2 shows I've been on have done set reports the same way.
Hmm.
So if you do a set report that's more just to your showrunner, to be like, yeah, number 1 was a little moody today, but we got through. I'm a little bit worried about this scene on Thursday because we heard some complaint, whatever. And you're not really talking about the shots. That's definitely where you want you to say to your editor, like, hey, like, if I have some favorite takes, do you want me to just email you what they are so you have that for comparison to the director select? Like, just open the conversation. They might say, no,
Hmm.
I'll be fine with director selects. Great. Okay. But you ask the question.
Hmm.
And if
Very
you,
cool.
and usually if you're doing a report where you are required to say, like, I love this shot, whatever, your editor's copied on that. So, know their name, address them by name, say thank you. Like, all those things are very important. And it's that with everybody on your crew.
Yeah.
Please and thank you and I really appreciate it are such incredibly valuable words.
Yeah. Oh boy. I I was on one remote show that was particularly toxic, and one of the things that told me it was toxic was I went back in the communication I had had with a couple of the people above me, and in 6 weeks they hadn't said one thing that was positive. and it emphasized for me just how much of a difference it makes when you can say something positive, when you can say something constructive, when you can build up. And sometimes we forget to do that, but it is really important.
It's really important. And again, especially when you're not having face-to-face communication, it's more important than ever. And then in terms of with your writer's room, again, hopefully you have somebody who's reaching out and saying like, "Hey, I'm here if you have questions, if you want to talk about anything, like you've got me." And different rooms handle it differently. The last room I was in, we ended up with this practice that I thought was incredibly invaluable, which is we did Thursday morning coffee hour. And so our first hour every Thursday, we would all just, be there. And like sometimes it was chitter chatter over the news. One of the writers was great at having like fun questions to throw out, and it would be like, like, what's your favorite memory from childhood? And we would all answer it. And you get to learn so much about the people in your room. And you don't get that stuff the same way, because in an in-person room, right, there's always chit chat. There's the 10 minutes in the morning, the 10 minutes ramping back up from lunch, the last 30 minutes where we're pretending we're still working, but we're all thinking about when we get to go home.
Yeah.
And like you get those fun stories and interactions. But on a Zoom room, it's usually so much more all business because Zoom is so taxing. It's just sort of like you need to find ways to build that community in the room. And hopefully that's important to the showrunner, and they're finding a way to help foster that. And if not, again, someone in the room needs to just be, I'm the room mom. I've been the room mom since I was a staff writer. I've been bringing cookies in to cheer people up since I was a staff writer.
Wow.
And so I am very much the person who's like, yo, look at this ridiculous news story I saw today, just to get people talking.
Very, very smart, actually. And the thing that people don't think about, whatever your specialty is, if you bring it to the room, it can help so much. I know one writer who their thing is comic books, so they became an encyclopedia of comic books. And there's a certain style of show where they want at least one on staff who is like that. And so she just keeps on getting hired and hired and hired because of that specialty that she brings to the table. And I know that anybody who brings, cupcakes or whatever, everybody loves them. and if you want to get liked, why not do something like that?
Yeah, and it's like I mean, baking was my fallback, right? If the writing hadn't worked out, I'd have a bakery somewhere. And so it's a way to do something I love that makes people happy, and it's very genuine, and so I love to do it. And I am sort of that, person who's like, hey, we're all here together, let's make it fun. So that comes naturally to me. And that's not going to come naturally to everybody else, but it's like, okay, what's my thing? Like, if you're the person who can just always tell a joke at exactly the right minute, that is an incredibly valuable skill. Because sometimes the room gets real tense, and then someone comes in with well, I think I need a glass of vodka right now. What about you? And everybody's like, yeah, I could use some vodka right now.
Yeah. Well, and it takes being an observer, too. I mean, people will drop little comments about things they like or don't like, and if you pay attention, gradually you can build up a little bit of a Rolodex of, hey, I know this person is into this thing. If I happen to see it in the news, they might be interested. And I mean, you're not just completely lost when you start.
Yeah. It's just, it's just being open. Really, it's sort of like stay open to the mood of the room. Stay open to, if you're feeling like maybe you need a break, everyone else is probably feeling like maybe you need a break, and it's perfectly fine to be like if you're on a Zoom and it's like, hey, can we take 10 minutes for a bathroom break? You can say it. It doesn't matter what level you are.
Well, I know we don't have time to go through every single thing in the book. I mean, you do deep dives into everything from lunch to the hierarchy in the room, etiquette of the room, when to speak, how to speak, dealing with bullies. We talked about that a little bit, different room styles. And definitely I urge people to buy the book and do that deep dive. But talk about one of the things I love that you covered in your book is sort of if you are in a minority or disabled, or there's some kind of um, challenge in that area, or you're in a situation where uh, things just aren't working with the showrunner.
Hmm.
Talk about those situations and what you can do about it.
Sure. I mean, a reality of so many of the diversity and inclusion efforts is, part of the way to get historically underrepresented writers into rooms is to say, like, if you're going to write these, characters from this Black Latin neighborhood, you need to have writers who look like that. Or
Mm.
if you're going to write a disabled character, you should have a disabled writer in the room. And which is great because it means people are getting opportunity. But it also puts your identity front and center in the
Mm.
room. And a good showrunner is going to make that safe for you, right? A good showrunner is going to make it clear to you, look, this is an important part of the room. I don't expect, like, that's not the only thing you're allowed to pitch on, like,
Mm.
I brought you here to hear your voice. So when you want to pitch, like, you are part of this room. Um, but there will be people who will find fault with that, right? Who think you're only there because you're the guy in the wheelchair, or you're the, non-binary human being who is supposed to represent all the, like,
Mm.
different sexual orientations in the show. And what the negative thing that can happen with that is, so say I'm in a room and we're pitching a story about a Black woman who grew up in Queens.
Mm.
It's a very specific background. I know enough people from New York to know that, Black
Mm.
or white, but definitely if you're a Black woman from Queens. And everyone's going to turn to me and be like, so Nicole, what about it? And
Yeah.
what I have learned is to say, well, that's very different from my experience, but I can do some research on it and I'll bring it into the room.
Mm.
Because I cannot speak for every Black woman in the world. I can't even speak for every Black woman in California. So I definitely can't speak for every Black woman in the world. And you need to be able to say that. I've had friends who've been very put on the spot by those things, and it's hard and it's a little bit scary.
Mm.
And another thing I think that's really important for people to remember is, even if your identity is part of why you got the job, you are only required to share the stories you feel comfortable sharing.
Mm.
Sometimes you think you're willing to tell every story, and someone brings up, for me, potentially, if someone brought up a story about a parent passing away, I lost my father several years ago, I might think I'm perfectly willing to talk about that. And then I get ready to talk about it, and something inside me is like, don't do it because you're going to break down crying in this room. Don't do it.
Mm.
Then I don't share that story. Now, I might take a pause and then come back and say, well, I knew someone who had this happen to them, and
Yeah.
and distance it from yourself so that it's safer to talk about. But you do not have to cut your veins open and bleed all over the room for the
Mm.
sake of the show. That's not healthy contribution to the room. That's doing damage to yourself.
Well,
So,
that actually is a great segue to another thing you talked about in the book was keeping yourself emotionally and mentally healthy through all of this. Talk about that side of navigating your life as a writer.
yeah, when you first start out, you will feel like you're so grateful to finally get an opportunity, and it's 24/7. I'm going to 24/7. I'm going to be in it. I'm going to be in it. No, don't do that, because first of all, you're going to burn yourself out very quickly. And part of what will give you things to write about is living your life, right? Like, um uh Phil Rosenthal always used to tell this story about, like, he would make his writers go home on Everybody Loves Raymond, right? He would be like,
Hmm.
no, go home. I need your stories. Go home.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's true no matter what, right? Even if you're not writing a family comedy. And That's where the richness comes in, is your experience. So I will say, like, when you get your first script, you're going to want to work on the script every waking hour that you have.
Hmm.
But you might get on script when your best friend is supposed to be getting married.
Yeah.
Newsflash: take the computer with you, work on the script on the plane, work on the script in the hotel room, go to your friend's wedding, and stay at the reception a little while, and then be like, I got to sneak out, I got to work. You will regret forever not going to something that's that important to you. So
Hmm.
you got to find a way to make it work. And it's essential training for your career as it rises, because the demands on you only get greater. It
Yeah.
feels like once you get good at it, it should be easier, but once you get good at it, people want you to develop, they want you to write features, you're partnering with people, you're teaching, you're doing all kinds of stuff, and suddenly you have way less time than you had as a staff writer.
Hmm.
So you need to teach yourself how to protect your personal time. And
Hmm.
if you're sick when you're a staff writer, you can be sick. You can text the showrunner and the number two and the writer's assistant, or email them all and be like, I'm so sorry. I'm super nauseous. I can't come in today. If you're running a hybrid room, or I think, quite frankly, every room should make it so now, that if you can log in, they can put a laptop in the room and you can still hear everything that's going on.
Hmm.
But you coming in the room when you're sick, first of all, most showrunners are germaphobes anyway. They were germaphobes long before COVID. So they're not going to
Yeah.
want you to come in sick anyway.
Yeah.
But it takes the stress off of it, right? That, like, oh God, I missed a day in the room, I'm going to get fired. No, you're going to log in, you're going to listen to everything. If you have something to contribute, you can, unmute yourself, your camera can be off. It's all fine.
Hmm.
But it's hard to believe that in the
Yeah.
beginning. And so I really just encourage people to, like, be clear on what is important to you, because that's
Yeah.
the stuff you got to protect.
Yeah. Though I mean, it is a balance because that doesn't negate the thing about arriving early and leaving late, and um, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, even from early on, I think one of the most damaging things you can do is say, "I will start that later." And I think you need to have that balance right from the beginning.
Yeah. It's really important, because I think, as many writers as you might meet, they all have different ways in which they handle their life, right? I have plenty of friends who are married and have kids and are full-time writers. I don't know how they do it, but God love them. I knew that wasn't a juggling act I wanted to do. So I decided to put all my energy into my career and my friendships and all that stuff. That's a choice, though. And so
Mm,
if getting married and having kids is important to you, you have to make time to pursue that. And it's real easy to lose yourself for 5 years in this career
mm,
and suddenly be like, oh, I meant to have kids. Oh no, what am I going to do? So
mm.
you just need to, like, be very aware of, okay, I want this career. This is absolutely what I want, but this is what I'm not willing to sacrifice to get it.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. We will start to wrap things up here. But one of the things I did want to mention, as if all that stuff wasn't enough, you've also got sample script pages for the story area, for outlining, for the synopsis, a glossary of lingo that you'll need to know, which is very important. And there aren't actually a ton of places you can find that lingo. So lots of great resources in the book. Any closing thoughts before we go? Advice to, like, one piece of advice that you could give people who are maybe coming into the staff for the first time, or want to be on a writing staff, or just want to break into TV in general.
Um, you know, Honestly, it's gonna feel so cliched, but it's so true. Like, you just have to keep at it. You really do. I mean, it took me 10 solid years of real effort. Like, the first couple years when I was like, I'm gonna be a TV writer, like, don't really count, but, like, from when I got very serious about writing specs and entering contests and applying for fellowships, 10 years.
Hmm.
And I have several friends that it took right around the same amount of time. And it's it's all building your muscles and it's all getting you ready so that when you do get in that first room and you do feel like you can't breathe because the race cars are spinning around, you're like, I did the work. I did the work. I'm going to figure it out. Like, it just, it's, there are people for whom it comes easy. I do not know many of those people. Almost every person I am friends with who is a working writer worked really hard for a really long time to get there. So I know it gets frustrating, and I know, like, I was very much like, I'm not applying for another fellowship, I'm done. And then I applied for one more, and that was the one.
Yeah.
So you just never know. You just never know. But if it's what you want to do and you're going to write even if no one ever pays you, then keep writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very cool. And also by the Writer's Room Survival Guide. And I really, really honestly think this will be something that you read once and then you refer back to again and again and again and again throughout your career. It's a reference book that I think you're going to love to have on your shelf. And so check the show notes for a link to buy it. And it will be available for purchase as of today, October 4th. So yeah, and make sure to follow Niceole on Twitter and Instagram, both Niceole Cookies, really easy to remember. And I appreciate it. You're very active on Twitter.
Probably more than I should be, but
yeah. And where is the best place for people to reach out to you?
It's probably honestly on Twitter. It's probably, the place I'm most responsive to that kind of thing. So
yeah. So at Niceole with an E, Cookies, and make sure to follow. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And honestly, I know it took a lot of work to write this book, and I think that work is going to pay off for a lot of different people and make this industry a better industry.
So much. I appreciate that.
Honestly, everybody who reads this book will eventually be, well, not everybody will be, but there will be a lot of people who read this book who will end up being the number 2, end up being the showrunner, and hopefully will take into account the things that you've mentioned in it.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Yeah. Thanks, Niceole.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for the episode. You can find us on the web at tvwriterpodcast.com or at scriptmag.com. The video version of this podcast is available at iTunes, Podbean, or YouTube. The audio-only version is available at iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or Pandora. You can find me on Instagram at tvwriterpodcast. Follow me on Twitter, @GrayJones is my handle. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.